Victor Black Masterclass presentation is brought to you by www.muscleandiron.com.
Sawadee Cup. Hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video. In today's video, we are going to be introducing the drug Clenbuterol. This is a new training module that is available in the Victor Black Vault. Either it's free for Masterclass members, or if you're not a member of Masterclass, you can access just this module on a standalone basis for the price of $9.97. Okay, now, whenever I make free material, and this will be produced and presented as a free video, I do my best to provide enough value in that free material that is worthwhile watching that content, even if you are not a member of Masterclass or if you don't go ahead and purchase the additional content. However, what I think a lot of guys really do fail to understand is that my free content is unashamedly intended as advertising or promotional material for the back end. So people say, I love your content, Victor. It's great. Keep it coming, keep it coming. And I don't think they understand that what they're actually watching is the marketing material. Now, in this video, I will do the following format, the same format I always follow. I try to present enough free information that people go, that was worth my so many minutes of time to watch. I learned something from that, but hopefully you learned enough, or you realize you didn't know enough to go, you know what, I need to spend some more time better understanding that subject. And so therefore I'm going to go and purchase the additional material that's available. So again, I'm repeating myself. I apologize. I find that is a condition I live with. And that is, I need to explain to you guys, this is the marketing material. If you watch this and if you go, wow, I didn't know that about Clenbuterol, I clearly need to know more. Rather than saying thank you, how about you basically, access the additional content that is behind the membership wall? As I said, you can just buy this module if you want. It's just $9.97. Okay, so let's get on with the video. And as I said, the first thing I would like you to understand about really all of my content is this. If you speak to someone about performance and image enhancing drugs, and they are unable to make a very credible argument both for and against the use of a drug, if they can't tell you literally the good, the great, the bad, the ugly of that drug, I wouldn't listen to them as voice. I don't find them credible. Very often you will find people who are so invested in a position where often they sell things like they sell Psalms or they sell this, that they only ever talk about the good of something. Or at the other end of the spectrum, you'll hear people that basically will just only ever tell you the bad about something. And that just, is disingenuous. It really is. You should be able to explain the great, the good, the bad, and the ugly of any drug that is in human clinical use. It's not reasonable position to say it's all bad news if they use it clinically in human beings. Okay, so in the spirit of that, I'm going to start this video by basically just going through some of the great, the good. We're going to get to the bad, we're going to get to the ugly, things you need to seriously consider if you're going to use this class of compound. But let's just basically begin with understanding that in the world of drugs that contribute to fat loss, in 2020, we have a very wide range of compounds that are available for us to consider. It's not 1970. We don't have half a dozen anabolic and androgenic steroids to choose from today. There are literally hundreds of compounds that you might consider here, hundreds. And there are realistically getting up to a dozen different classes of fat burners that you might consider here. Now, this conversation is about the drug Clenbuterol. And of course, Clenbuterol fits into one of these classes, which happens to basically be the adrenogenic agonist class. Now, if you have trouble pronouncing this word, and we're going to explain this in a minute, let me just basically explain. If you think in terms of adrenaline, okay, that'll remind you what the wording is here. So adrenogenic, adrenaline, okay? And as you can see, I've put a red box around that class of compounds, and we're going to talk specifically about one compound within that class today. I show you this graphic to explain to you that there is going to be rather, content on many other fat burners that you might consider to either use instead of Clenbuterol, if you make a decision at the end of this material that it's not for you, Or alternatively, if you wish to make or create a strategy which is premised on using small amounts of many of different drugs that work on potentially different metabolic pathways, this is a class of drug that is very complementary and very synergistic with with other classes of compounds in this category, fat loss. Okay, so let's get started with the video. I think the biggest misconception about clenbuterol in our tribe is simply this: it's a very polarizing drug. You speak to some people who use it and don't have a problem with it, and you speak to someone that quite a lot of people actually that see it as the devil's poison. Like, oh, it's a terrible drug. It's really dangerous. It's one of the most dangerous drugs that basically you could potentially expose yourself to. And I wanted to start with the great and the good of clenbuterol because I think, like so many compounds, this class of compounds is in some cases unnecessarily vilified, and in some cases people don't understand the very real risk of its use. So we're going to cover both of these. But before I do, I want to be very clear here in that this class of compound, this class of basically beta-2 agonists, actually has therapeutic potential in a number of areas, including muscle wasting disorders and areas of neuroprotection that most people are just completely baffled by. They go, I had no idea that clenbuterol or even an alternative beta-2 agonist has a potential clinical application here. So I just want to go through this very quickly. Of course, the video is what that's for. But really, everything from sarcopenia, age-related muscle wasting, to muscular dystrophy, to motor neuron diseases, to catabolic stresses, burns, and cancer muscle wasting. There's a very, very interesting application in a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and that's really important because we talk about that right at the end. We talk about risk. I'm going to come back to that. It's very, very important clinical application there. Obviously, in the treatment of diseases like Pompe disease and peripheral nerve regeneration, and as I said, in the prevention of neuron loss in some pathological conditions. The point being here is, do not mistake this drug as being something that is quote unquote bad for you. Just draw a line through it. That class of drug is crap, right? This class of drug, even today, right, is currently being considered in a number of clinical applications. No question, there are problems with its clinical application. We're going to get to that, right? But either a drug that we currently have used in a certain way, right, in a certain protocol, or potentially a new compound that is more selective towards specific receptors, and we'll talk about that again in the larger body of information, ultimately is going to find its way into potential clinical application in these types of diseases. All right, there are some that are clinically approved today, and there are obviously more coming. Okay, more coming. A couple of quick notes here for people that are surprised by, as I said, what clenbuterol can actually do. Clenbuterol actually might be a protein it basically might repress myostatin levels, and it upregulates follistatin. And it's also neuroprotective, as I said, in certain pathological conditions. So this is by no means, should you look at this class of drug, or indeed this drug, as basically saying, quote unquote, the devil's poison. That is completely disingenuous and completely unreasonable. And as I said, I want to show you some of these studies. This study I marked up here, this is from 2016. Okay, yes, it's a couple of years old, but the point being is, they are absolutely still looking at this class of compounds and looking at clenbuterol specifically in research into its mechanism of action and how it functions and what we can learn potentially for clinical application in this class. By no means did they draw a line through this drug and write this drug off 20 years ago and say, oh, it's horrible. It has no place in our world. That's disingenuous. As I said, that's just simply not true. Okay, so as I said, even in conditions like as a possible drug candidate for Parkinson's disease, this is a drug that has a very wide range of metabolic pathways and is very, very interesting. And as I said, most people that you speak to will simply be completely oblivious to the potential therapeutic applications of this class of compound and indeed this drug within that class. Okay, so as I said, I'm skipping through through this material, but I understand that's the point of the body material. We're going to get into this sort of stuff in more detail. Even with the potential application towards diabetes management, okay, there's a number of consequences of the administration or the stimulation of these adrenal receptors that basically has potential metabolic benefits, including in the treatment of diabetes management. Okay, so the starting point for the discussion, chapter 1 in the Victor Black Masterclass Vault, is basically explaining that there are actually, to date, a number of different adrenal receptors that have been identified. Okay, in the class that we are talking about, in other words, the beta adrenal receptor class, there are actually 3 subtypes. Okay, now the naming convention I used before, as I said, if you think in terms of adrenaline or noradrenaline, these 2 chemical compounds are the endogenous or naturally produced ligands that bind to these receptors and produce biological response based on which one of these receptors that those compounds bind to. Now, you probably know adrenaline as the hormone that's principally responsible for the flight or flight response. And I said, we'll get into this in more detail as we go through, but just understand that basically what we're doing here is creating synthetic drugs or synthetic ligands that are designed to basically bind with these receptors that basically function in much the same way as adrenaline, noradrenaline do, but with a greater or lesser degree of potency and a greater or lesser degree of selectivity towards these different receptors. And that's very, very important as we go through this discussion to understand that there is a degree of selectivity towards those receptors for each of the different classes of adrenal receptor agonists. Now, on the right-hand side, you probably can't see it very well in this graphic. The graphic's a lot clearer in the masterclass material. You can see here it's enough to say there's a list of drugs listed down here. And what this graphic is basically showing us is the degree of selectivity that these drugs have for those specific receptors. Because then we understand that those receptors have a particular role to play, and the different classes of the drugs with this compound with a greater or lesser degree of selectivity towards those receptors have different consequential outcomes based on how tightly that affinity is, that they bind rather with those receptors. Okay. Right. Now, in the material, we will be talking about the mechanisms by which clenbuterol exerts its hypertrophic actions. It's enough in this material just to understand that it's not a simple discussion, and I will try not to get too bogged down in the main material, but it's enough to say that in very, very, very simplistic terms, one could argue that it's through the promotion of muscle protein synthesis and the reduction of muscle protein degradation that we see an increase in hypertrophic outcomes. This is true. However, as I said, there are a number of different mechanisms by which that might happen, as I said, including the repression of myostatin, including the regulation of follistatin, including things like clenbuterol seems to create a rise in systemic insulin concentrations and increases blood flow to various target tissues. The point being is that even the mechanism of hypertrophy is actually quite a complicated discussion here. Now, when I use this drug personally, okay, I tend to use it principally for its effect on fat loss, right? I don't necessarily use it principally as a hypertrophic agent. I don't dismiss its functionality in that way, but because I use other compounds, I really tend to see this through the filters of clenbuterol as a fat loss agent. So we'll be spending some time talking about that and talking about how it functions in that regard. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that, particularly with this concept of like you have to cycle on and cycle off, and the downregulation of beta-2 agonist receptors, and the use of antihistamines and as I said, there's a very interesting conversation to be had about how this class of compound actually functions. It's enough, in my opinion, to understand that ultimately it is absolutely true that beta 1 and beta 2 adrenogenic receptors downregulate with prolonged stimulation. This is true. This is very well understood. However, when it comes to fat loss, when you understand the full picture, you will understand that the receptor on which we are actually trying to target by using this as a fat loss agent, not only does it not downregulate, but potentially it upregulates with the long-term exposure of the drug Clenbuterol or any other potential beta 2 agonist for that matter, I should say. Okay, so as I said, we will cover that in some detail in the masterclass members area. This is a supporting statement for that. I will be talking about this. I find this very fascinating. Whenever you talk to people and they have a negative connotation about Clenbuterol, one of the first things they start talking about is the tremors that are associated secondary to Clenbuterol use. So you take the drug and it causes the tremor. And what I think a lot of people don't understand is that this has got actually, this is not drug specific. This is nothing to do with Clenbuterol per se. It's to do with a class of compound in which Clenbuterol exists. So all of the beta 2 agonists, right, will cause this effect to a greater or lesser degree, and usually in a dose-dependent manner. And we'll talk about, what's the underlying cause, and then the big one, which is, okay, so is that a concern? Is there a implication for safety or implication for health consequential to that tremor? Is that bad for us? And that's something we'll cover in the masterclass material, obviously. And really, this is what I really want to get into, the meat and potatoes of this discussion, which is, really leading to this discussion. So, is this a drug that we can consider to be safer to use? I don't like to use the word safe when it comes to PDs. It is very true that there are very clearly identified potential side effects of beta 2 agonist use, okay? Most of the frequent side effects are things like nausea and headaches, insomnia, as I said, muscle tremors, palpitations, headaches, etc., etc. I personally am honest enough to admit, I don't really suffer too badly from these things. I don't get nausea. I don't get headaches from the use of it. This list of things is not of huge concern to me, okay? However, there are some things about Clenbuterol that I am concerned about and that I do pay attention to. One of the things that I think that people should be interested in is that this drug has actually been used clinically in certain classes of patients at doses that might make your eyes water. There is actually an application for the treatment of people that have undergone the implantation of left ventricular assistance devices. So in other words, devices that are implanted to assist the heart with its function, where they deliberately and intentionally overstimulate the receptors in the heart with Clenbuterol at doses up to 700 micrograms 3 times a day. Wow, okay, 2,100 micrograms a day, okay? That's a lot. Now, interestingly, ask yourself, what are they trying to do here? They're actually trying to deliberately and intentionally create cardiac hypertrophy, okay? Cardiac hypertrophy is a very real consequence to the use of performance and image-enhancing drugs, and this class of drugs. Indeed, it's being deliberately used in this particular application to create that hypertrophic effect. Okay, so you're taking a heart that is in a atrophied state, okay, deliberately using this compound to make that heart stronger and bigger, okay? Now, the most important part of that is you go, okay, so how dangerous can it be if they're deliberately trying to do that with that? It's a little bit like the conversation of the women shouldn't use testosterone, but it's okay for transgender, people, right? You're kind of thinking, so as long as you're deliberately setting out to induce that effect, it's not a question of it's not safe, okay? It's that you probably don't want that effect in some people. So the logical extension of this becomes, if you have a normal heart, a normal, healthy, functioning heart, Ideally, do you want to create a hypertrophic situation there? No. No. But if you have someone with a very weak heart, this drug and its mechanism of action in creating hypertrophy is saving their lives. So its clinical application and its consequence of use, therefore, is conditional. It's not this much will kill you. It's like, probably don't want to do that because you have a normal functioning, healthy heart. But if you don't, then this drug potentially could save your life. But have a look at the amount that they need to use, right? In this application, as I said, they're using 700 micrograms 3 times a day to induce that effect. Now, that doesn't mean I dismiss this discussion completely, but it does change the filters I see this discussion through, much like the discussion about the overuse of androgens in women. It changes when that's what you're intending to do with it, right? It's not so much a safety thing. It's like, well, is that what you really want here, right? Is that the outcome that you're seeking? And in certain medical conditions, that may well be the outcome you're seeking. So if you're a normal person with a healthy functioning heart, would the application of these types of doses of this drug be a good idea? I would say hell no, right? But that doesn't necessarily automatically mean it's the devil's poison. It means that drug is not suitable for that individual because of that consequence, but under certain different circumstances, it may well save their life. Okay, so as I said, we will go into that in detail in the members area. Now, one area that I wanted to point out here is that I mentioned before that Clenbuterol has the potential to assist even in the treatment of diabetes because of one of the ways in which it has a mechanistic action. However, there is an issue here about how Clenbuterol actually might raise insulin resistance in the heart. So it's improving insulin resistance in skeletal muscle tissue and other organs, but there might be a problem with the way that it basically interacts with your heart and how it raises insulin resistance. So again, we need to drill down into these conversations in a little bit more detail and understand the good, the bad, the ugly, as I said, of the drug as a whole. Okay, so as I said, this is the slide that complements that, saying, okay, so this is pretty much like a yin and a yang. So in certain organs and certain tissues, this is good, but in the heart, maybe not. Okay, so again, this is a dialogue. This is a discussion. There's also, for women, a discussion I think that you need to be made aware of, that there is a relationship, or at least a discussion that you need to have about the use of this drug and breast cancer. Okay, I'm going to get into that now, but if you get into the masterclass areas, if you're a woman, you should and you use Clenbuterol, you should at least be aware of that relationship. At least be aware of that relationship. Okay, so when I talk about safety and toxicity profiling for this drug, really the questions that I want to know for myself is that, can we consider Clenbuterol to be safe to use? What benchmark would we use to hold it up to say, based on this information, based on this evidence, I would consider that to be a drug with either a reasonable or an unreasonable risk profile. And the truth of this is this drug is absolutely, in my opinion, a drug that you need to understand if you're going to use it. And there are genuine issues with its abuse. Okay, typically the issues present themselves in a dose responsive manner, which means basically this: the more you use, the worse it gets. Okay, there are many people around the world using therapeutic doses of this drug on a daily basis that do not appear to be significantly consequentially affected by its administration. And what I'm talking about is basically therapeutic doses in the vicinity of about 40 micrograms a day. Okay, that is the clinical therapeutic dose for Clenbuterol. There is an argument to be made about what is the upper limits of safe use, and we'll talk about how they arrive at that number in the masterclass material. And I'm not necessarily going to argue against that number beyond one point, and that is, like all these drugs, you have to understand those benchmarks that were laid out about what might be the upper limit is premised on that drug being used in isolation. And this is always the problem for bodybuilders. What about the way we use it? We're using it in a stack of drugs where we have to have a consideration here for polypharmacy use. So if that drug can be considered safe at that dose, all right? That statement, you have to understand, is premised on the fact that that's the only compound that you're using that would be considered to be, deleterious in that regard, okay? What about when you put this with this, with this, with this, when you start stacking it up? I think the only logical, rational thing to do is to say, you know what, you probably need to downgrade that fucking recommendation to a decent margin. So if X amount is considered to be safe, premised on this argument, fine. So what about when we start bringing other compounds in that have somewhat similar risks attached to them, okay, like cardiac health risks? Maybe we need to downgrade that recommendation to some degree. And this is fundamentally how I arrive personally at my usage level. Yes, I don't have a problem with understanding that there has been authors of research papers that have made suggestions, or I wouldn't call them recommendations, guidelines for what might be considered upper tolerable limits for the application of this compound in human beings. Okay, but as I said, you need to take into account polypharmacy in that discussion. And if you do take that into account, if you're saying, well, hang on a sec, clenbuterol is not the only PED I'm using here, then I would say that you need to downgrade that recommendation significantly. And I will explain what that means to me, at least, in the masterclass members area on this drug. So that's it for today's video. As I said, this information is really intended to be marketing material, promotional material, getting you to realize that, you know what, maybe there's more to clenbuterol than you know, right? There are potential applications for clenbuterol that might be beneficial to you that you were completely oblivious of. Maybe there are things that you were not aware that are potentially deleterious to your health, that are concerning to your health, okay? But the point is that, as I said, hopefully you look at this material, go, I found that to be interesting, and I realize I need to learn more about this compound, as I do about other compounds in the world of PEDs. And then we go from this free material to becoming a member of Masterclass. So I hope you will consider doing that. In the meantime, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And I look forward to seeing you inside the Victor Black Master Vault for the clenbuterol training module material. Sawadee Cup.
Victor Black Masterclass presentation is brought to you by www.muscleandiron.com.